The Villers-Bretonneux Military Cemetery is the largest Commonwealth War cemetery in this region of the Somme. A total of 2,142 Commonwealth servicemen are buried here, with graves brought in from nearby battlefields and burial grounds. The Imperial War Graves Commission constructed the cemetery between 1920 and 1930 to a design by Sir Edwin Lutyens, later the architect of the Australian National Memorial. The Stone of Remembrance, which is central to the site, commemorated those who lost their lives in war and is erected in cemeteries containing 1,000 or more graves. The inscription on the stone, selected by British author and poet Rudyard Kipling, was taken from Ecalistes, "Their name liveth forevermore." The Cross of Sacrifice, located in the centre of the cemetery, was designed in 1918 by Sir Reginald Bloomfield and is present in all Commonwealth War cemeteries containing 40 or more graves. The sword and the cross emphasise the military character of the cemetery and the religious affiliation of most of the dead. A register of the graves in the cemetery is kept in the gatehouse at the entrance to the Villers-Bretonneux Military Cemetery. The Australian National Memorial commemorates those who fought and died on the Western Front in France during the First World War. The names of 10,700 Australians with no known graves are inscribed on the memorial, listed under their units. A controversial design for the memorial by Australian William Lucas was eventually abandoned, and Sir Edwin Lutyens, who had designed the cemetery, stepped in to complete the project. The design reflects its Australian connections. The tower with the Australian rising sun sculpture above the entrance is a distinctive element, complemented by the great circle inside the top of the tower that points to significant battlefields on which Australians fought. The memorial tower was damaged during the Second World War, and while it was repaired following the end of the war, bullet holes are still visible on the tower, retained as a deliberate reminder of the impact of war.
The Sir John Monash Centre tells Australia's stories of the Western Front in the words of those who served. Set on the grounds of the Villers-Bretonneux Military Cemetery in northern France and adjacent to the Australian National Memorial, the Sir John Monash Centre is the hub of the Australian Remembrance Trail along the Western Front. It establishes a lasting international legacy of Australia's centenary of Anzac. This cutting-edge multimedia center reveals the Australian Western Front experience through a series of interactive media installations and immersive experiences. The SJMC app, downloaded on each visitor's personal mobile device, acts as a virtual tour guide over the Villers-Bretonneux Military Cemetery, the Australian National Memorial, and the Sir John Monash Centre. The experience is designed so visitors gain a better understanding of the journey of ordinary Australians, told in their own voices through letters, diaries, and life-size images, and connect with the places they fought and died.
Hello and welcome to the Sir John Monash Centre. My name's Rebecca Doyle and I'm the Centre's Director. The Sir John Monash Centre, located close to Villers-Bretonneux in northern France, tells the story of Australia's experience on the Western Front during the First World War in the words of those who served. It uses cutting-edge technology and multimedia supported by objects of significance to Australians to provide visitors with a truly immersive experience. More than 295,000 Australians served on the Western Front. Of these, 132,000 were wounded and 46,000 lost their lives. The Sir John Monash Centre ensures the words, experience and stories of sacrifice of these men and women are preserved for generations to come. This virtual tour will be followed by an opportunity to talk with the Visitors Services officers.
The Sir John Monash Centre was built in France as a tribute and to tell the story of the more than 295,000 Australians who served on the Western Front from 1916 to 1918 and the 46,000 who died here. The centre showcases Australian materials, craft, culture and technology through timber, the design and the displays. The Australians who served on the Western Front are no longer here to tell their story. Time has taken that generation from us. But they left behind traces of who they were and what they experienced in their letters, diaries and memoirs. Today you will catch glimpses of them in film, footage and photographs, walking on duckboards with uniforms caked in mud, or smiling and posing for a camera in French towns while on leave.
Hello, I'm Lorraine. Welcome to the Sir John Monash Centre. Australia was one of the numerous countries to take part in the First World War. Having been one of the only countries to have an army composed of voluntary soldiers, this screen explains the reasons behind Australia's involvement on the Western Front, more than 15,000 kilometres away from home.
The British declaration of war meant that her empire was at war. Those self-governing dominions like Australia could decide the extent to which they would support the mother country. Australia's constitution prevented her small army from serving overseas. But Australia's Prime Minister pledged a new force of 20,000 men. The new force, the Australian Imperial Force, was recruited and made ready in 6 weeks. Individual Australians went to war for sincere and patriotic reasons, for an adventure, for a well-paid job when times were difficult, or because mates went off to war together. Propaganda suggested that a triumphant Germany would march on Australia. The greater fear was that if Britain was defeated, the Royal Navy would no longer provide the shield, which Australians thought vital to their protection.
The Battle of Pozières is one of the bloodiest confrontations in Australian military history. This battle involved troops from the 1st, 2nd and 4th Divisions of the Australian Imperial Forces. In less than 7 weeks, they suffered 23,000 casualties, including 6,800 dead. Australia's war correspondent Charles Bean commented Pozières was more densely sown with Australian sacrifice than any other place on earth. This screen describes the conditions endured by the soldiers.
I pray you never encounter a modern bombardment. It is simply hell let loose. No chance of burial for the dead. They slowly rot on the ground, mangled and remangled by shells.
On the 1st of July 1916, the Allies launched their greatest offensive yet, here on the Somme. That day was the most costly in British military history. After 3 weeks and an advance of 3 kilometres, it approached the village of Pozières. As part of the British offensive, Australia captured the village and continued attacking toward nearby Mouquet Farm, launching 19 attacks over 6 weeks and suffering casualties from which they never fully recovered.
We were all anxious for the barrage to begin. When it did, it seemed as if the earth opened up with a crash.
Pozières was a great cloud of red brick dust that rose and floated away towards the sky.
The 28th marched across no man's land as if they were on the parade ground, the German shells blowing them to bits.
In one charge, we lost 19 officers and 670 men.
Men of weak nerve buried their faces in the dirt and clawed the soft ground as if trying to hide themselves, while stouter hearts climbed over them and went towards the enemy.
Nowhere in Australia's military history has taken such a deathly toll so quickly as Pozières. This was an experience of war that few are called on to endure. The bombardment reduced the town to brick dust. The unimaginable noise of it never relented. Charles Bean, the official war historian, was there. An eyewitness recording the scene with accuracy and eloquence.
Shell after shell descends with a shriek, each shrieking a promise to each man, I will rend your flesh and pulp an arm and leg. 10 or 20 times a minute, every man in the trench has this instant fear thrust upon his shoulders.
A man alongside me was crying like a child and saying, "We will never get out of this." I kept replying, "Yes, we will."
Our boys hang on to the captured trench like Trojans, though killed and wounded fall all around them.
The shelling was awful. Our leader was shot before we arrived, and the strain sent 2 other officers mad. I was buried twice and thrown down several times.
They looked like men who had been in hell, drawn and so dazed that they appeared to be in a dream.
With casualty rates equalling nearly 60% following Fromelles and Pozières, the Australian public were stunned. Declining volunteer numbers created a crisis in the eyes of Prime Minister Billy Hughes. Beginning with Gallipoli, the casualty list published in the papers had shocked Australia. Those following Pozières had been particularly harrowing, and there seemed to be no end to the slaughter. Following the first flush of young, adventurous and patriotic men who joined in the first few months, recruitment declined. But under the Australian Defence Act, men could not be called up for military service outside of Australia. Introducing conscription required a change to the Act, and the government put the question of such a change to the people, including the troops serving in France. in the form of a plebiscite. In October of 1916, Prime Minister Hughes put the question to the public in what has become known as the first conscription referendum. Following an often angry and socially divisive campaign, conscription was narrowly defeated. The troops in France voting narrowly in favour. A second referendum was put in December 1917 and met with a similar fate. The decision placed a great strain on the organisation and standards of the AIF. But it meant that when the war ended, Australia had the only major all-volunteer army on the Western Front. In January 1998, 50 metres from the village of Courcelette and 250 from the memorial to the 2nd Australian Division in which he served, the remains of Private Russell George Basisto were unearthed by a farmer ploughing his field. Basisto lay complete with all his equipment, including his identity disc, buried by an artillery bombardment that killed him on the 4th of August 1916. Reburied with full military honours on the 5th of July 1998 at Courcelette British Cemetery, Russell Basisto's standard-issue spoon, penknife and razor, along with his rifle, bayonet and gas mask, are now displayed at the Army Museum in his hometown of Adelaide.
Over the 3 years that Austria served on the Western Front, more than 181,000 men were injured, of whom at least 46,000 died. The greatest number came from artillery fire, small arms and poison gas. Recovering and treating the wounded required an efficient system of doctors, nurses, stretcher bearers, ambulance drivers, orderlies and clerks. These following images will give you more information on the medical war, which was a war within the war.
We fell again and again, and the patient slid into deep mud. Every few yards we had to rest. The wounded man lay still. The doctor came out and examined him. Then he looked at us. This man is dead.
83% of Australia's total war casualties occurred on the Western Front. A death toll that had been reached after 8 months on Gallipoli was almost matched in 6 weeks at Pozières and Mouquet Farm. Like the fighting soldiers, the medical services adapted, reacted and learned. Survival depended on clearing casualties from the battlefield quickly. But some wounds would never heal.
The stretcher squad, with utter disregard of danger, rushed to the spot and attended the wounded in spite of an intense enemy barrage.
When a man is wounded, I dress him, frequently very crudely, for conditions prevent surgical cleanliness. I send him away and see none of his treatment.
Every hour or so, someone dying and being taken out, only to be followed by someone else in an hour or so.
There were only stretchers and blankets, and as soon as the patient was operated on and put back on the stretcher, it gradually sank into the mud.
Many wore discs with their next of kin's address, asking for someone to write to their people and tell how and when they died.
At any time somewhere on the Western Front, and more usually at many places along the front line, the air was full of hot, jagged metal. Artillery was the most potent force in the war, and every army had its legion of victims of shrapnel and splinters from shells, while bullets from machine guns and rifles were also a constant hazard.
Went the shells. As we gazed, a terrible sight met our eyes. A man was walking towards us with the whole of the lower portion of his face shot away.
No words can describe the awfulness of the wounds. Bullets are nothing. It is the shrapnel that tears through the flesh and cuts off limbs.
Gas took a terrible toll. It could blind, it could burn, it could destroy a man's lungs. But the most common severe and permanent wound was limb loss. And limbless soldiers became a common sight in every country that had fought.
Dear Mum, just a few lines to let you know that I'm getting along all right. I got wounded in the head, through the left shoulder and the right forearm, the left thigh, chest, and on the right leg. I have some bad news. They had to cut my leg off above the knee, but I consider myself very lucky that I got away from such a place as we were in.
A winter on the Somme is something Australian soldiers had probably never experienced before, and they can be really freezing. This screen describes the soldiers' experience during one of the coldest winters on record.
Cold has no name for it. Ink is frozen. The mud is frozen. And of course, we are frozen.
The Somme winter of 1916 was the coldest in living memory. And Australians, used to warmer climes, suffered terribly. Although care packages from home provided comfort, and major campaigning came to a halt, the fighting continued.
The Germans tried to take our Lewis gun and used liquid fire and bombs, but we beat them off.
The Australians could proceed no further than the centre of no man's land. The Huns likewise. The absurd position was scores of attackers and defenders bogged up to their waists, only a stone's throw apart.
Tears made courses in the mud on his cheeks. I wish I could die, he said.
When spring arrived, spirits lifted, and campaigning resumed, with the British launching their Arras offensive. Meanwhile, the Germans had withdrawn to the Hindenburg Line.
After Bapaume, the course of the war enters a golden age of Australian arms. A brief sunburst of glory, which ends in the gloomy clouds of Bullecourt.
Within a week of the outbreak of war, the wife of the Governor-General, Lady Helen Munro Ferguson, had established the British Red Cross in Australia. By war's end, there were more than 2,000 branches across the country, involving 82,000 women and 20,000 men and boys. They spearheaded the making, collection and distribution of parcels for the troops, comforts. In addition to medical supplies and kitchen equipment, the Red Cross parcels would include more than 320,000 pyjamas, 457,000 shirts, 130,000 pairs of underpants, and 1,163,049 pairs of socks. By one calculation, about 10 million hours went into knitting comforts. These activities extended beyond Australia and provided canteens wherever Australians went on leave. Corporal Eric Roper wrote home from London
The Anzac Buffet is a really wonderful place. Anything and everything you could wish for. Pianos, reading rooms, billiards, nice young ladies.
The seasons are sharply defined here. The dry ground, fine weather and long days of spring and summer were the campaigning seasons. But the weather is unreliable. Rain falls in every season, and it is the mud that endures as the great symbol of the Western Front.
On foot, one has to go very cautiously. Last time we were here, one of our officers rode into a shell hole. His horse disappeared in the mud, and he was only rescued with great difficulty. He had to be pulled out with ropes, and in doing so, they strained his internal organs.
A cycle of freezing and thawing turned the battlefields at Fleur and Goudecourt into a morass of slush and mud during the winter of 1916. Rheumatism, trench foot and influenza all took their toll. But worse still was the constant state of exhaustion from simply existing in the quagmire.
There was literally nowhere for the men to sit down, and many of them spent the whole 24 hours in a standing position, with this wet, clammy mud up to, and in some cases over, their knees. Sleep in the front line was almost an impossibility.
Let me tell you about an artifact I find quite interesting. During the war, soldiers let their imagination and creativity loose upon some of the millions of shell cases that were fired. This is called trench art. We can find a very original example of it here at the centre. This is the shell decorated with a kangaroo and a dotted pattern, reminding us of Aboriginal art. This object gives us an idea of Australian soldiers' activities during quite a time in the trenches, but also proves that during one of the most brutal times in our history, soldiers kept in touch with their humanity through creation.
This display looks at the effects of the First World War on the Australian community. It displays some beautiful silk postcards, which I'm sure have taken pride of place on mantelpieces back at home. While initially made in 1900 for the Paris exhibition, they became very popular during the First World War. It's estimated that 10 million were sent at that time. They were the handiwork of French and Belgian women who worked from their homes in refugee camps. The embroidered silk was then sent to factories for cutting and mounting onto the postcards. Some would contain a small silk pouch where a letter or a token of affection could be added. They touch on many themes. These in the centre talk of love and affection. To my darling mother, forget me not. And my personal favourite, heaps of kisses to my darling. I'm sure the families that received them must have dearly cherished them.
Digger Quest app is a new activity for our younger visitors to the centre. Guided by Australian animals, the children are invited to complete quests and explore the galleries in search of clues and answers. Each fun task then helps them to learn more about the Australian experience on the Western Front as they are immersed in the stories of the Australian soldiers and nurses.
Hello, I'm Sean. Welcome to the Sir John Monash Centre. During the First World War, soldiers did not spend all their time on the front line, but they couldn't return home. While they were not in battle, soldiers could have time of leisure, and they were very helpful to local farmers. This screen describes what life was for the Australian soldiers when they were not fighting.
We are billeted in barns with any amount of straw. Any amount of mud and slush about here. But it doesn't take long to get used to it.
In a typical cycle, a battalion would occupy the front line for 4 days, the support line for 4, and then into reserve for 8. This meant that the Australians were behind the front for the majority of their time, training, on work parties, refitting, or in billets. Leave was seldom granted, long leave even less often. For the Australians, leave never meant going home.
Dead beat best describes our state. Yet the boys find time for jokes, banter and songs.
New clothes were issued, and the men were refitted generally.
It was like a breath of home to the majority of lads to find themselves again on a farm. And they insisted on doing everything possible to help the poor old men and women who were doing the farm work.
Our first feed was a generous one. 4 eggs each with fried potatoes, bread and butter and coffee. The lot cleaned up and we sent her off for 4 more each.
Leave, a chance to get well away from the war, came seldom. And for Australians, it never meant a chance to go home. But it did offer an opportunity to visit what many thought of as the mother country. At any given time, there were many thousands of Australian troops in England, training in supply and administration roles, as medical staff or patients in hospitals. More were there for a brief respite from the action, to travel around, seeing where their family had come from, or drawn to the great attractions of London.
We visited the Abbey, St Paul's, the House of Commons, the zoo. We had great fun trying to find our way around.
The pub seethed with men and women, talcum powder in clouds, carmine lips, roguish smiles, and pink and white softness. Here was life.
Easier to get to and equally diverting was Paris.
Paris, vivid and wonderful. On the boulevard was all the feminine beauty of the world. One walked beside me in the leafy glory of the Bois de Boulogne. Others wined and dined with me.
But when conditions were right, the sound of the guns could be heard, even in Paris and London, where the reminders could be even sharper.
I noticed everyone looking up and I saw about 20-odd aeroplanes. It needed no one to tell me that they were Hun machines. It was the biggest raid that London has had yet.
The men never forgot that the days were passing and they would have to go back. And neither did their girls.
You and your pals laugh at the dinner table of your life in the army, but I know that there is a hideousness you do not speak of, for it is in your eyes, in your unguarded moments.
I stayed at Renescure last night, struck up a yarn with an old French farmer couple. On parting this morning, I gave the old madame a pair of Fritz glasses. As I made off, they were sitting together seeing what they could see through them. But they'll never, never see their 3 fine sons again.
Maman wept, kissed and embraced Gelson and me, who had been billeted with her. She gave us each a 5-franc Napoleon pour bonne chance, filled our water bottles with the best wine and packed cakes in our haversacks with another bottle of wine. Her last words were, "Je vais prier pour vous."
On the morning we marched out for the line, I saw the old priest. The ancient cleric appeared to be interceding for these men who were returning to a hell out of which few were to come alive.
The soldiers who served in the war often suffered horrific wounds and were left with both physical and psychological trauma. This included facial disfigurement, amputation, and a condition known as shell shock. The following videos contain confronting images of the lasting effects the war had on those who served.
It is not so hard to see a man die as to break the news to him that he will be blind and dumb for the rest of his life.
An estimated 37,000 Australians suffered facial wounds. But physical injury was only part of the story. By the 1930s, nearly 13,000 returned Australian servicemen were receiving pensions for psychological damage.
Went to Sidcup and saw Newland do a bone graft of a jaw. Excellent technique.
I became deeply interested in this new work and would stay up half the night trying to reduce a complicated plastic operation to diagrammatical terms.
Thanks to you, I will have a home. The woman I love no longer finds me repulsive, as she had a right to do.
His eyes were staring out of his head. He could only mumble.
The remorseless bombardments of the First World War were held accountable for a condition that all armies reported, and in unprecedented numbers. The initial diagnosis was that the shock of the artillery barrages was such as to cause the brain to knock against the skull. Hence the term shell shock.
All day long, the ground rocked and swayed backwards and forwards from the concussion. Men were driven stark, staring mad, and more than one of them rushed out of the trench towards the Germans. Any amount of them could be seen crying and sobbing like children, their nerves completely gone.
It became apparent that the condition had other, deeper causes. Specialised hospitals were established, both in England and in Australia.
For nights I sat with him. He would scream out, "Oh God, the shells are coming, quick, down for your life." I would hold his hand and assure him he was quite safe.
Extreme cases found men wholly debilitated by the condition. Others became suicidal or unable ever to return to normal life. Martin O'Meara's mates called him the bravest man they'd known. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for carrying wounded men from the field of battle. But following his discharge in 1919, it is reported that his health broke down completely, and he spent the remainder of his life in a mental hospital.
The loss of a leg on the Western Front was a considerable loss to me, whose chief recreations were swimming and walking. I could still swim, but walking is no fun to a man with an artificial leg, which feels, when he is tired, as if it were a ton in weight.
In the decade after the war, 3,000 Australians were receiving pensions for limb loss. This high incidence of limb loss inspired two key changes in prosthetic technology: the introduction of the lightweight metal limb using an aluminium alloy, and standardisation in manufacturing methods. Initially, the wounded preferred crutches, but the alloy limbs were half the weight of the old wooden style. Doctors, however, little understood and could do little about stump and phantom limb pain, which were often lifelong issues for those affected. Those with facial disfigurements found adjusting to life even more difficult.
There is a special hospital set apart for all wounds of the face and jaw, and there are 2 wards each for the various colonial soldiers. I am put in the Australian wards, and there are some Australian medical officers. There are some fearful disfigurements here. Poor men have only parts of a face, but it is marvellous how they are patched up. The doctors make a special study how to put on new noses, new mouths, etc.
Facial reconstruction could require numerous operations with long intervals between them. After shrapnel smashed his face during the 3rd Ypres campaign, Private William Kersey of the 33rd Battalion spent 18 months in hospital and underwent 29 operations. Many, even after reconstructive treatment, had to wear masks to conceal their missing noses, ears, mouths and jaws. Even so, people averted their eyes, and the deep psychological wounds never healed.
Always look a man straight in the face, because he's watching your face to see how you're going to react. As soon as I was out of sight, I sat and cried, for my heart felt like bursting, likewise my head.
The Battle of Le Hamel was a significant battle for Allied troops during the war. The newly appointed commander of the Australian Corps, General Monash, planned his battle with meticulous care, making good use of the artillery, planes and tanks available to him in support of the infantry.
In May 1918, General Monash was appointed to command the Australian Corps, replacing the British General Birdwood. He took command in June and in July, demonstrated his qualities as Corps Commander with victory at Le Hamel, a village that had fallen to the German onslaught, Operation Michael, in April 1918. It was an ideal place to test the new combined arms tactics, in which tanks, aircraft and infantry would work together.
The role of the infantry was not to expend itself upon heroic physical effort, but on the contrary, to advance under the maximum possible array of mechanical resources.
On we go towards where a machine gun had been holding up the advance, until one of the tanks waddled around it,
By 1:15 in the afternoon, the Australians, with some American troops joining their ranks, had reached Le Hamel, their objective. The Australians' stunning success at Le Hamel proved the value of Monash's approach, and those tactics were adopted by the Allies for their counter-offensive of August 8th. But this time, 50,000 men would move forward under Australian command.
Planes were flying low overhead to drown out the noise of tanks and gun limbers. There were men everywhere. The organisation was wonderful.
Monash's meticulously planned victory near the village of Le Hamel, combining infantry, tanks, artillery and planes, set an approach that would be adopted for the battles that lay ahead. On 8th of August, the British Fourth Army, including the Canadians and Australian Corps, launched an assault from this location, while the French and Americans would advance in the south. The Allies would not relent until the guns fell silent on November 11th.
There was titanic pandemonium. Thousands of field guns blended in one long drawn-out chord. The ugly noses of tanks poked through the fog. Then a rattling of machine guns told us that the lads were at grips with the enemy.
Aeroplanes were in the sky in their hundreds. They dropped ammunition and bombed and strafed whenever the opportunity arose.
Order of the day, August 7th, to the soldiers of the Australian Army Corps. For the first time in the history of this corps, all 5 Australian divisions will tomorrow engage in the largest and most important battle operation ever undertaken by the Corps.
This brass cigarette box once contained Mahalia cigarettes. It now contains 137 pins, each with a small oval-shaped label with a unit name in black ink and, in most cases, colours to reflect the unit's colour patch. The note on the paper label on the top of the tin explains that these are flags used to mark on fighting maps locations of all units of 3rd Australian Division. The flags were used by Sir John Monash during his meticulous planning for the Battle of Le Hamel. One of many used by him, the tin is from the John Monash Archive at the Australian War Memorial.
After years of fighting, soldiers could not believe the war was over. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed and the fighting could cease. This screen describes how the soldiers experienced the end of the war and eventually returned home to Australia.
It was hard to believe the war was over. Everything was just the same. Tired troops and cold, drizzly winter weather. Just the same as if the war was still on.
The feeling had taken hold that perhaps the war would never end. Then suddenly, it was over. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers found themselves on a battlefield which was strangely silent. When would they go home?
Hostilities will cease on the whole front on 11th of November at 11 o'clock.
There was no cheering, no undue excitement. I think we all grinned. The event was too big to be appreciated all at once.
The war has become such a habit that it has become impossible to realise what peace would really mean.
We had 2 victories today. We won the war and defeated the 5th Field Company at Stocker.
Slowly, It would take many months. The men of the AIF would go home. And so would thousands of war brides and many babies. General Monash insisted that those who had served the longest would be the first home. But this meant breaking up the battalions.
The battalion, our father and mother of unforgettable years, was drifting to pieces. The links that connected it with the unforgotten dead seemed to be snapping one by one.
In 1921, I married Vera Carey, a typist from our office. In 1927, we adopted a daughter, Betty, bought a house, and in 1929, I was elected to St Kilda Council and became mayor a year later. I didn't know that the Depression was just around the corner.
My face was messed up a bit. Some people reacted badly to soldiers who had facial injuries or limbs missing. Seemed harder to get jobs, children were frightened, that sort of thing.
Under the Returned Soldier Settlement Act, a soldier of satisfactory character could apply for a lease of a small property. I got a soldier's settlement block in Kui Rup. This was an old swamp that had been drained for farming. By 1924, we had lost a lot.
I got home and wanted to go back to rural Tasmania, but things there were not as good as before the war. A lot of blokes chose not to go back to the family farm, but went to live in the big cities.
One thinks, are these medals worth the memories they recall? Missing, prisoner of war, killed in action, killed whereabouts unknown. So hard for a devoted mother. I am sorry and sad.
At night when I am alone, I allow myself to remember. I sometimes think it helps me to readjust my balance, but I don't know. For it is then I quiver again with the shock of explosions and fear. I smell the gas again.
I never married. My reason for living, Captain Harold Alfred Southern, was headed for the Western Front, but finished up dying on Gallipoli on the 2nd of May 1915.
More than 100 years after the First World War, the Sir John Monash Centre is a place to reflect on the story and sacrifice of the Australian men and women who served on the Western Front.
The Centre's tribute tables link directly to the National Archives of Australia. Visitors can search for the name of a soldier who served during the First World War and leave a tribute. The soldier's name will appear upon our poppy wall for the remainder of the day.
we hope that you found this virtual experience of the Sir John Monash Centre interesting and thought-provoking. It's been a pleasure for us to welcome you, and we'll now introduce you to members of our team who are looking forward to speaking with you and will be delighted to answer any questions that you may have.